Welcome to another edition of the Learning Reinvented Podcast, brought to you by myself, James Poletyllo, and the team at the Learning Effect. Today, I'd like to welcome Adam Gibson to the podcast. Adam, welcome. Would you like to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, James, and it's a pleasure to be joining you. So I'm Adam Gibson. I'm a consultant in strategic workforce planning. It's been my focus for a number of years, and I've led workforce planning, people analytics, and talent management across a number of different organisations, and have recently finalised my book, Agile Workforce Planning, which is all based on my methodology and approach.
So, Adam, we wanted to talk to you because workforce planning is one of those things that's a term that for some people can be a little bit hazy. So what does it mean? What is workforce planning?
Workforce planning is definitely one of those things where you could take 100 practitioners, ask them that question, and they'd come up with 200 different answers. For me, workforce planning is fundamentally about trying to create the right mix of work and workforce in order that an organisation can achieve its strategic objectives. Breaking it down, it's about trying to find the right workforce, and I talk about what I call the 7 rights. Right at the heart of that is this concept of capability. So that'll be the combination of knowledge, the things that we're able to access readily in our heads, skills, the things that we've practiced, mindset, how we think and feel about the things that we're about to do, our physiology, because certainly some things that we might need to do will come from a physical standpoint. And finally, environment, often overlooked, but I think we'd all appreciate that a great environment and a poor environment on whether you can be successful or unsuccessful in bringing a capability to bear. So to that concept of right capability that sits right at the centre, we then start thinking about our other 6 rights. So we think about the right size. Have we got the right number of that capability? We think about the right location. Is it in the right geographic location? And is it in the right structural location? We think about the right time, not only the time at which we need it, but the duration that we need it. We think about the right cost, the financial cost, and the opportunity cost of using that capability in a different way. We think about the right risk. What are the things that could happen and it leaves us exposed to based on the choices that we're making? And finally, the right shape. How do all of those capabilities gel together? How do they combine? What are the subsets of those capabilities that we'll need to make sure that we've got the right levels that they align together? Do we have the right number of managers to workers? When we're thinking about concepts like diversity and inclusion, what are the targets that we might have around those things? And where are we now? And how do we bridge that gap? So those are the things that we think about when we start talking about this concept of workforce planning and how we can use that to make better organisations.
So Adam, why is workforce planning so important?
Well, we've all gone through one of the biggest shifts and changes that we'll have been through in our lifetime with the pandemic. So organisations have been shocked in 2 different ways. They've been shocked on the supply side. So their workforce hasn't been able to work in the way that they have done previously. Their supply chains have been affected. So organisations that might be providing services to them haven't been able to provide those in the same way. Indeed, they've been shocked on the demand side. So their customers have changed and they are buying things in a different way. And for some, they're not able to access those services at all. So with those changes going on, organisations are now finding themselves in a place where they need to consider their future in a different way. Their future is a new future, and everything that's going to happen isn't what they were thinking it was going to be 6 months ago, 12 months ago, a year, further. So when you think about those things together and an organisation still wanting to be successful and still having objectives that it wants to achieve, still having a broader strategy, and organisations having a purpose of why they exist, those things still remain. So workforce planning in the current setting allows you to start thinking about those things in the right way, so that you can balance the work and workforce in the right way, to ensure that you're able to achieve your objectives.
It's quite interesting at the moment because, like you said, every industry is facing some level of disruption, whether that's real challenge to the industry through to almost over demand. So, suddenly those, Amazon, I'm sure, is dealing with lots of demand that it may not have had, or it's had a big set demand, but it may be increased, or healthcare provision is having to deal with new ways of working with extra restrictions, etc. So given that, how do organisations almost start tackling workforce planning or turn it into something practical if that's not something that's been called out before in how they've been operating?
And let's take both of those examples. So if you look at it from an Amazon example, again, back to the two shocks. So from a supply side perspective, their workers have not been able to operate in quite the same way. They've now needed to work in a way that is more distanced, and they've now had to have new safety measures. So if you're looking at things from that perspective, you now need to think in a very different way about how those workers can still work to be able to deliver the right outputs. At the same time, you've got what we would all recognise for Amazon has been a significant shift in demand. We're all at home. Many of us not able to go out. If we want things, we're buying them we're doing the one click buy. We're not going off to the shops. So demand has absolutely skyrocketed. So you've got people who are now having to work in a different way, where you probably can't have the same volume of workers in the same space, and yet the outputs that they need to achieve have rocketed significantly. So how do you try and bridge that gap? You've got to bridge that gap by thinking very differently about how that workforce may be employed. Maybe you have to look at different shift models so that you're able to work to get people working in a different way to try and create the right outputs. But indeed, with a huge spike in demand, you've also got to try and recruit. So what things that are probably being considered are there new innovations that will allow an organization working in that way to be able to use technology that might overcome some of the limitations that people and safety will place upon us. But equally, looking at things like probably having to have new sites, new locations, and try and recruit a workforce into those locations so that they're able to satisfy it. What I would suspect has probably been done is that an organization such as Amazon has probably been operating at an ability of spare capacity. Why would you do that? Because every Christmas there's a spike in demand in exactly the same way for Amazon products. So they will probably have scaled themselves anyway so that they're able to social distance and they're able to increase the size of their workforce without having to purchase new sites. So if they planned in that way, they've got greater ability to be able to do that. But then let's take the NHS as a different example. Huge surge in demand, and again, restrictions on the way that people are working. So those things are still coming together in the same way. So what are some of the steps that that they have taken? From a demand side, they've clearly been working with the government to try and take steps that will mean that their demand peaks have been shifted. So that has been very much the theme of the lockdowns, that by locking people down and reducing the spread of the virus, it wouldn't necessarily eradicate it, but it would mean that demand for hospital beds could be spread out over a longer period of time, and that demand would not hit at the same time as other peaks in healthcare demand, which typically happen around the winter time. So they've taken steps around demand management by working with government in doing so. Equally, they've been looking at very different ways of how they provide their services to the public. Many people have found that appointments that would have been done in person are now being done virtually. They're finding that they're being done in different ways, and the services have slightly changed. So all those things are being done from a demand side, from trying to manage that demand. But equally on the supply side, they recognise that there's going to be a need for additional workers, additional beds. They've done that through the building of the Nightingale hospitals. They are increasing the extent to which they recruit. And indeed, I think it was their chief nurse had made a plea to those who had left healthcare to ask them to return on a temporary basis during the pandemic. So they're the kind of steps that you can take when you start thinking about how we do things with the workforce. And that's very much looking in the short to medium term. Taking a longer forecast and starting to think forward, that's very much the way that I help organisations to think and act, to try and do those same steps, but do them over a longer period of time so that you can take action now that will achieve the right result for you 2, 3, 5 years down the line.
So it sounds like it's a very holistic approach to looking at, a workforce challenge, not necessarily looking through one silo. So where do you tend to find workforce planning sits in an organisation? Is it an HR function? Is it a business operation function?
It differs. In my experience, it very much differs between organisations. I have found it within business operations. I find it within finance. I find it within HR. So it sits in different locations, and that often tends to be based on where it grew from. So if you take a heavy operational organisation, both the examples of Amazon and NHS being great examples, they do a lot of having to schedule people by shifts. So as a result, they will have a strong handle on what we might term resource management or resource planning. That activity that we would be doing over the next 3 months, certainly within the current financial year. And if you've got a strong capability along those lines, then your broader workforce planning capability may well sit within operations because it's grown out of that short-term workforce management practice. With many other organisations, you might be looking at what we do the next financial year, what I call Horizon 2 operational workforce planning. Now, we see this in organisations all the time. It's the budgetary process. So a finance department will often do that level of planning. They will fix things on the basis of budgets. And therefore, when they start thinking about how that translates into the workforce and headcount numbers, you might find that it starts within a finance department. It's often those organisations that are more forward thinking on a strategic perspective that actually generate it out of an HR function. And therefore, when it starts within that area, your start point tends to be within to be thinking about people. And therefore, you start to approach it from that perspective of we need to be thinking about the right people we need in order to ensure that the organisation is successful. What's great is where you can find some element of combination of all of those. Because actually, when I see things that have generated purely out of an operational strand from workforce management, or an operational workforce planning from a finance function, or indeed a pure HR function, there are bits that get missed when each group approaches it. So often a finance function won't be thinking in terms of capabilities, in terms of skills. An HR function may not be will probably be thinking purely in terms of talent management approaches, and won't be thinking about things that we might call demand management and demand optimization, which is a crucial first step when you do workforce planning. And indeed, on the resource management side, that may well be done at such a local level that when you start trying to increase this and do it at scale, you miss things. So the great workforce planning happens when you can combine all of those areas together.
So it sounds like a lot of those activities may be happening within teams across the business. They may not be joined. It may not be badged with workforce planning. A lot of our listeners on the podcast are going to be in the field of learning and development, possibly stretching into talent. So if you were speaking to a learning and development professional was thinking, actually, what Adam's talking about is really interesting. Where do I dip my toe in? Where do I start to understand the contributions as a learning professional I could have, or impact I could have on workforce planning? Where should they start?
Start by, I suppose the place I always start is with why. If you no matter what professional you are within HR or elsewhere, then why. And often the why for often the why for a learning professional is around trying to build capability. To build being what I term one of the 7 Bs, the 7 workforce planning levers that you can pull that create and build capability. So they'll be thinking about it from that perspective of we want to create some capability. But what specific capability? When is that capability needed? In what workers does that capability need to be created? To what level does that capability need to be created? Those are all workforce planning questions. They're all the questions that you would ask to try and understand truly what is it that you need. I've seen a lot of learning professionals who have simply been asked to deliver a particular learning outcome, but there's no real understanding there of what difference that will make to an organization. And that's what we're all about, whether we are in finance or we're in HR, whether we are learning professionals or whether we're something else within an HR function. We often think because we're in that field, it all relates to the people, but actually those workers only exist in that concept because they are part of a workforce, because they're part of an organization. So what we're trying to create is successful organizations. So therefore, we're trying to think about what is the organization trying to achieve, and therefore what we're trying to bridge. What is the gap we're trying to bridge? And that's what we do when the learning professional will be trying to create that capability, but to understand really the difference that it can make. And fundamentally, which is often such a difficult question to answer, which is what is the return on investment for this learning intervention? Workforce planning is what allows you to do that. So those learning professionals who are watching, who perhaps find themselves being constantly challenged about a particular initiative, connect it back to what the organization is trying to do. Demonstrate what that learning intervention will do to create one of those 7 rights. And that's the place that I would certainly say is a great place to start.
I think it's interesting looking at the different options or the lenses that people will look at something through. So, it makes sense that if you're a learning professional or an HR professional, you're going to look naturally, we would presume, through a people lens. So when someone says, actually, we need to deliver more of that, you're looking at potentially some sort of efficiency, but often how do we get more resource in? How do we bring in the temps at Christmas? When back at the start of my career in retail or when I've worked in hospitality, you up the workforce at certain times, and that's built into your business calendar, your finance calendar. That becomes the way of things happening. I think it's interesting to how do people start to challenge their thinking around that it isn't just looking at it through my lens, and there might be a possible other way of us meeting those challenges, and the creativity of less predictability over the last few months. I think there's some really interesting thoughts as to how people can broaden their horizons, as to we don't just need more bodies, or we don't just need to give our existing bodies those other skills. What are the other types of things people can be looking at?
Again, it's a case of always start with why. It's going through that why that helps you start to answer those questions and start to uncover the different ways. I also advocate really being clear once you've understood the why, and then you've worked through the gap. What is that gap between the supply of the workforce and the demand for that workforce? Because that's what we're trying to bridge when we think about trying to create these interventions on a learning perspective or whichever. So if there's a gap that needs to be bridged, try to understand the totality of it. What is the totality of that gap? When does it need to be bridged? And if it isn't bridged, what are the implications of those things? When you really understand the problem statement, that's what starts to open up the possibilities of what else you can do. It's quite easy for people to go to a conference and see someone inspiring talk about something that they've done in their own organization, and just think, oh, we could do that in our organization. Or watch a podcast and say, oh, we could do exactly the same thing where we are. but actually that might not be right for that organisation. It's what I sort of tend to refer as stealing other organisations' artificial grass. There's a reason that lots of organisations have spent money on beanbag chairs and ping pong tables and then don't know what value that's going to bring. Why do they do that? Well, some of the tech giants had great performance and great engagement, and they thought, well, if we do the same, then our engagement will be great. But there was no cause and effect that they'd established. They hadn't understood what the problem was that they were trying to solve. So once we're clear on what the problem is we're trying to solve, actually that opens up a lot more possibilities. And by then taking the time to consider different initiatives, and what I strongly advocate, which is to work more broadly and collaborate, working with those frontline areas, because you might be thinking as a learning professional, well, great, we've got a learning intervention that would work fantastically here. But if you speak to the people on the front line who are dealing with it, they may well have a much better solution, a solution which is cheaper, quicker to implement, and one that they'll actually get behind. So take a step back, understand the problem, and bring together a community of people who are close to the problem, can bring you expertise from other areas, take some outside thoughts, bring those together. And if you've got multiple initiatives, analyze them, run a cost-benefit analysis to try and compare which is going to be the best initiative. Does it deliver the return on investment? Does it deliver us value for money? Does it solve the problem we were trying to solve in the first place? By taking that broader approach and understanding the problem, that means that you can end up with much better solutions, and crucially, solutions that will be delivered rather than just a great idea.
So it sounds like, some simple principles of understanding the problem, really understanding the context, and you can't just steal next door's ideas or a similar company's ideas, because the context, once you get inside a company, is different, whether that's budget, culture, history, structure, all of those things will be different. And Absolutely. Then engaging with those frontline users so that they can be part of that problem, because in the ivory tower we can all come up with some great ideas, but what's going to work? And then some test, learn, evaluate, implement, and make that more iterative. So I think some really good principles just that can be immediately transferred into any approach to learning, not just workforce planning, but any learning initiative should have those at its core as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
So Adam, one of the things that we'll hear often, not just in learning but across business, is that machines and robots are going to take over the world, so all learning can be pushed online and AI or machine learning will do everything for us. What's your view on the whole drive towards AI, tech, robotics, and the fact that machines will replace us all?
It's a great question. Technology, automation in the form of, whether it be robotic process automation or machine learning, artificial intelligence, it's important and it's not going to go away. And in fact, what it's doing is making many of our lives much easier by having interventions around technology. What it can start to do is take lower value work, start to eradicate that, take away the tasks that we do that are repetitive, that infuriate us, and remove those so that we can start to focus on greater value work. Undoubtedly, there are going to be people whose jobs will come to an end as a result of technology. Far many others whose roles will be fundamentally changed in some way as a result of this technology. So it's not going away, and it's something that we're going to have to accept. But one of the things that technology does is it creates new jobs. So every time we have gone through an industrial revolution, jobs have been eradicated, new jobs have been created. There are now roles that exist that have never existed before, and there are children, the children who are at school today, your kids, James, my kids, they are, they're the jobs that they will have as an opportunity when they're older don't exist today. Some will continue, many more will be created that we can't even envisage right now. So there is always going to be a place for people doing work within organizations. So that's a critical thing to recognize. And therefore, if there's a place for people, from a learning perspective, there's always going to be a place for learning. There's still going to be a requirement for human people, to learn new skills, to develop new skills, to take on new knowledge, and to be able to use that, to make a difference. Where we're really seeing technology make a considerable difference is back to that aspect of capability that I mentioned earlier: skills, knowledge. Knowledge is the information that we've got readily available in our heads. There was a time, if you rewind the clock back 10, 20 years, that if you're using something like Microsoft Excel, you would need to have a great deal of knowledge about Microsoft Excel. But what about now? Even I Google constantly how to do particular Excel formula. I don't need that knowledge. As we've got greater democratization of information through technology, knowledge is actually becoming increasingly less important within the field of work. Great to an extent, because that actually allows us to increase diversity, the diversity of our workforce and the diversity of thought that we have in our workforce, because now we're able to bring in different people to which may have been in organizations traditionally, because it's now being opened up. So we are starting to see that shift. So there's going to be a change from a learning perspective, in that learning may well be less about creating things that people can know and more to do with creating things that people can access, creating information that people can access. But then the final bit of, can everything be shifted online? We've done this a lot over COVID. COVID has meant that those who are working in a learning environment have had to do a significant shift to doing it in an online way. And we would recognise that learning objectives are achieved. Learning is passed on. Is it here to stay? I don't think so. I think naturally, once, we don't know what form the pandemic will take. My confidence is that over time we will be able to start to return back to many of the things that we hold so dear, which is to be able to work in a community where we are seeing each other face to face and interacting face to face. And it's not that we return to, the way that we were all sit in our cubicles, almost a modern equivalent of the dark satanic mills, but that we're still able to collaborate face to face, person to person on as we go forward. And I think that is still going to be valued within the learning environment. Being able to really pick on the genuine nuances of conversation and of verbal and non-verbal cues is much easier to do when you can actually physically see everyone, rather than if you can only see the top part of their head. And if you're trying to do that at the same time that you're presenting something on PowerPoint, you probably don't get to see that. So we are definitely missing something by not being able to do learning in a face-to-face way. And I cannot wait for us to be able to return back to it.
I think it's interesting in terms of those changes we've had in COVID and some of the challenges we've seen. But what I've seen from learning colleagues is they're currently getting presented with challenges to create learning on. And reflecting back on what you've said, they may almost fall into their investigation of how they put that together, falls into workforce planning, because people will be asked to put together a program on working from home, put together a program on leading a remote team, put together something on digitalization of your business. And those are sometimes the sophistication of the initial asks of a learning team. So,
yeah,
those are some very common challenges people will face. So, I'd love your sort of perspective on how you can actually approach those in a slightly more holistic way than let's just whack on a 2-hour Zoom call on how to work from home.
And it's back to that question of why. What is the problem that we're trying to solve? What is the challenge that we face? It is presented in that second hand of, here is the specified output that I wish to create, rather than this is the problem that we're trying to achieve. And the reason I love doing what I'm doing is I don't pretend to have all the answers on the solution. I bring together the people who have those genuine answers. What my focus is on clearly defining the problem. There was a quote that I think has been famously ascribed to Albert Einstein, but I think actually came from a professor at Yale, which was that if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 of those minutes defining the problem. Because anything else, if you try and rush to solution, and that's naturally what we do as people, we naturally rush to solution mode. But often it means that we don't define the problem. Worse, it means that we might rush to solution, but we're probably not going to do it ourselves. We're probably going to delegate that down to someone else, and so the nuances of the problem then get lost. To try and create a nebulous presentation on working from home, well, quite easy to do. Working from home. This is a home. This is what working looks like. This is working from home. But actually, what's the problem that we're trying to solve? Well, we might be trying to solve an issue about people who are working from home are actually doing so on dining room chairs or odd dodgy three-legged stool that's a bit wobbly. They're trying to do it on a table that isn't suitable. They're trying to do it from a laptop where the screen's too small. So we've got problems about musculoskeletal issues and stress in our physical nature. So is that the problem that we're trying to solve? Because it relates to working from home. But that is a very different problem that we might try and solve through learning to when people are working from home, they are feeling a lot more distant from their colleagues. They feel less engaged. They're feeling less like they're part of the team. It's impacting their mindset and their ability to deliver for the organization. The learning output you need to create for that is it's fundamentally different. Both are a presentation about working from home, which was the ask from the original stakeholder. So by going back to that why, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? What are we trying to achieve? Helps us formulate whether it's a learning intervention or something else. Because you might sit there and go, well, how long is it going to take to be able to provide learning of how someone might adjust their home setting in order to be more comfortable and have less musculoskeletal issues? How long will it take us to create that? What will be the cost of creating that? And then what will be the cost of the time that people will then spend doing that? And for many people who can't really make too many adjustments to a three-legged stool, is that going to solve the problem? Should we just solve the problem by spending money on giving our workforce the peripherals at home, chair, keyboard, the monitors? Shall we do it that way? It's taking a demand side approach to solving that same problem. So always start with why.
I think that's, key to a learning professional, which are sometimes, as you said, presented with a wrapped up solution of this is what you must deliver, some sales training or working from home training, of having that confidence and the skills to be able to drill down onto that problem and look at the more holistic solutions that might be there, and maybe not trying to solve every possible situation as well, because your problem might be the three-legged stool, someone else's problem might be the flatmate who's on furlough and wants to party till 3 a.m. So, it's again thinking about those different parameters and trying to create the culture of people being able to support themselves as well. So I think back to your point on user engagement. Adam, I was interested in an article I read that you wrote a little while ago about capability decay and how COVID had contributed to that, but it happens anyway. Do you want to talk us through a little bit more about that and why it's important?
Of course. So capability decay, you may know it by things like skill fade, skill decay, but it's fundamentally about this broader concept of capability. So over time, there are three things that will undoubtedly decay: your skills, your knowledge, and your physiology. And let's just take any example of that. From a knowledge perspective, one of the things that happens, I think, in organizations across the world is that during their main holiday season, which for us it's Christmas, people take a period of annual leave, and then in the first week of January, everyone's straight onto the IT department to try and get a password reset. Why? Because over the 1 week, 2 weeks of annual leave, they've forgotten their password. Knowledge. Every single day up until then, they've gone onto autopilot to automatically type that password in, and the first day back from annual leave, they can't remember for the life of what it is. Knowledge has decayed. Think about the things that you might be skilled in, that you might be able to do. I like to think that I'm reasonably adequate at golf, and I'm really not. I'm dreadful. But if I don't continue to practice, I really deteriorate. My ability, my skill really deteriorates in that regard. So it's something that you need to practice. And in terms of physiology, those who might engage in genuine physical activity, again, their physical abilities, their strength, their muscle memory will start to decay over time. So unless something is constantly used, it will start to decay. So what does that mean? So when tests have been done along this, what it means is that those who might be engaged in one role where they have used a particular skill for a length of time and then stepped away into a slightly different role, we might interview them, we might look at a CV, and we'll see what they've done, and we'll go, well, we'll be able to bring them in to do a role that was similar, that requires many of the capabilities that they were using, not in the current role, but in a role that they were doing before that. And actually the current role adds some value. But then the assumption is made that you can just drop them straight into some of the previous scenarios and they'll be able to do that. And those things take time to come back. Skills and the ability decays constantly. Now the thing, it's a constant thing that we need to recognize. That's what happens as humans. If we don't continue to do something, if we don't continue to think about something within our knowledge, it fades. If we don't continue to practice skills, our ability fades. If we don't continue to do physical elements, our physical abilities fade. But this is particularly pertinent when you think about COVID, because as this has gone on, the abilities that people had that were largely centered around working in an office or a factory in a particular way, in a particular set of circumstances, that is being lost. That ability is decaying. So the skills, the knowledge, the physiology surrounded that made that successful is decaying. Every single day, that is being lost to an extent. So when organizations are thinking that they may well start to reopen up previous ways of doing something, so they might be thinking, well, when we get past this second rise in the pandemic, so when we start looking at early 2021, let's reopen one of our facilities and we can start to bring people back in. That can't be done without some form of capability building. That centers on learning. That is going to be a critical component to people being able to return back to the work that they were doing. Just because they used to do it and it all worked fine back in February doesn't certainly, by no means means that a year later in February 2021, they'll be able to return back to doing that in a seamless way. Because the absence of not doing it not only decays it, what decays it even faster is having to have done something in a completely different way. So they've spent the last year trying to achieve the same objectives, but in a fundamentally different way. And what organizations might be trying to do is return back to previous way of doing things. So that makes it even more difficult to try and return back to that same level of knowledge, skill, and physiology.
I think, you know, you can recognize that in all parts of our lives as well. You know, we had that weird period where you couldn't really go out apart from one walk a day or one bout of exercise. And I certainly know as I've started to venture back out, you almost feel like you're in an alien planet and you're doing things that you haven't done for ages. You know, getting on the tube or getting on a train or going out and being part of the wider world suddenly feels strange because it's not just part of the normal. And sometimes you flick back in quite quickly, but there's other things where it's taking some time, which just feels very, very odd.
Yes, and it's different, you know, because we've often framed this around this concept of skill, we try and think about really tangible skills. I mean, and it happens across all levels of skill, but we forget, you know, we really aren't conscious of those little things, you know, the password reset, knowing the best place to stand on the, when you're waiting for the train or the tube. All those little things that we have learned and developed over a period of time are the things that often are the first things that we forget.
Absolutely. And I can see going back into an office, almost some of those shortcuts, the people you should go, the way of behaving in an office. You know, it almost seems quite strange when you go out for a meal or a drink or any of those other things. It feels slightly alien.
Yeah.
And people are going to be going back into environments that are maybe familiar but different.
Yes.
You know, and we've seen people who've been through that consistently when they've been working in hospitality with changing rules every week, where they're having to evolve to that. But we're all going to be facing that at some point soon. So it'd be really interesting to know what can organisations and individuals do to best support themselves and their people through that.
A great thing to do is to remember that just because people are on furlough doesn't mean they can't learn. It was one of the great provisions that came out of it, that though those who were on furlough were by right certainly not permitted to work, because that would defeat the purpose of it, but learning was very much permissible. So utilize that opportunity. If you've got people who are off on furlough, start to think about what are going to be the gaps that you will have. And this is what workforce planning is about. It's not necessarily about thinking what we need to solve, what is the problem that we have right now, but it's to start to think forward to say, let's assume we are back in the office, in the factory in February. We'll have spent 12 months out of it. What do we think are going to be the gaps that people will have in terms of their capability? And how can we start to bridge that gap with interventions today? It's about what we can do today to help solve the problems of tomorrow. So start to think about what those issues are. What are the things that people are likely to have forgotten about? What are the things where people might have the greatest degree of uncertainty and nervousness about when they return back to the office? And then look at what are the interventions that you can do while people are on furlough. And if you've got people who you've not got on furlough who are still working, look at what are the interventions you can start to trickle in now, or ensure that you've got the time set aside in January, in early February, to be able to bring people back to the way that you want to be able to work, rather than putting people through the unnecessary stress of forcing them into a situation where they are genuinely not going to have the right level of capability to achieve your outcomes. Because organizational objectives are only achieved by successful people. They are not achieved by simply having people there.
Adam, one of your recent successes has been you've recently finished your first book. So congratulations.
Thank you.
So what is the book about? Just a 2-minute snapshot.
Yeah. So the book is called Agile Workforce Planning. I was self-taught in the field of workforce planning. It's something that I had to learn as I went within particular roles. And so I would learn by doing, and I'd learn by trying to digest what was existing. And what I found so much was that the traditional concepts around strategic workforce planning kept on bumping up against unnecessary issues. And I think much of it has been damaged by a craft of people coming in on a consultant basis into organisations to do workforce planning, and the end result being the plan. And you'd think it was that way because it's called workforce planning. But by having an end result as a plan, an organisation would then be disrupted and the plan would be worthless. And that was what much of the narrative was that I was hearing from organisations. They tried it, they created a plan, and then everything changed. So I looked to create something that was much more agile, rather than it being a defined process with a particular end. It was something that would become a constant process where what you were trying to achieve was not the workforce plan. The workforce plan was a stepping stone to create the workforce. And so I developed this methodology, which I developed into the Agile Workforce Planning methodology, because I drew from those Agile principles of constantly looking and reevaluating and reassessing, and appreciating that you can't write a plan now that you can guarantee with certainty that will look out 5, 10, 25 years. It's about creating something that's part of business approaches and making sure that you are constantly reassessing and re-evolving the plan to create that right mix of work and workforce. I very much see it as understanding, being in a boat, understanding the destination that you're sailing to. A great workforce planning is about adjusting the sails and shifting the rudder as the waves hit and the winds change. Great workforce planning is about doing that and continuing to sail to the right direction. It's not simply around getting to the start, saying that's the island, and then leaving it.
So when will people be able to get their hands on the book?
3rd of January, it will be available for release, although it's currently available for pre-order from all good bookshops.
Fabulous. And if anyone wants to follow you in the interim or find out more about your thinking, how's the best way of them doing that?
I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter, Adam Gibson Tweets, and my website, agileworkforceplanning.com. There's a great deal of content on there and blogs that I've written on the subject.
We'll make sure that all of those details are in the notes below the podcast. Adam, thank you very much for joining us today.
James, thank you. Always a pleasure. Take care.